The next part of this afternoon is for me to introduce you to Wendy Irwin. So Wendy is the head of equality and diversity at the Royal College of Nursing, and she represents the and has supported the inequalities of nurses from a diverse background in the workplace across a whole wide range of settings. And she particularly focuses on the improving the experience and outcomes for the diversity of the nursing workforce across the UK. I met Wendy online, as we meet everybody online these days, when Wendy was chairing an incredible session for the celebration of the Mary Seacole Awards. And she did it with such passion and such experience and enthusiasm that it was inevitable that we were going to ask her to support this session. Particularly as one of our pieces of work is, my manifesto would be how we can support more nurses and midwives from diverse backgrounds to become chief nurses. And that's one of my pledges over the next few years. And therefore, fulfilling that role and fulfilling that piece of work that we need to do, it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Wendy. And we do have Yvonne, who I understand is listening in her home in Hampshire. But thank you very much, and Wendy, the floor is yours. And I think we've got a bit of time at the end for some questions. So if something pops up in your head that you need to ask Wendy, then do make a note of it, and we will chair a question and answer session afterwards. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon, primarily because, you know what, I haven't seen people outside of my house for kind of about a year, and I was just thinking, how am I going to do this? So it's been wonderful to connect with real human beings and not simply kind of images on a screen. It's been really interesting as well just to listen to some of the conversations. So sitting with Sheila and the groups that I've been listening to, is we've been talking about this thing called diversity and these wonderful thing called inclusion.
Just move your microphone, just so.
Is that better? Ah, fantastic, brilliant. So I'm going to talk to you and share with you some thoughts that I have about inclusive leadership and why it matters for nursing. But before we do that, I just wanted to share some reflections on a really kind of interesting week. For me professionally, for me personally, but thinking about some of the things that we've seen across our society when it comes to talking about racism, some of the things that we've seen across organisations around defining what they describe as the kind of conduct that they want to see from leaders. It's been a really, really interesting time. And what it's shown me is that this idea of leadership is not something that simply belongs to people that sit at the top of an organisation, but it is something that belongs to all of us, each and every one of us, every single day, in every single thing that we do. It's a job that we actually can't quit from, and it's a job that we never take a break from. And if that sounds exhausting, I think it is. It is really, really hard to be someone doing work in what I describe as an EDI or a justice space. And I don't think that that is relegated or solely the preserve of people with my kind of job title. If you work in nursing, it's also yours. This wider thing about social justice, this wider thing about human dignity, this wider, deeper thing about social justice is ours. So I wanted just to share just some reflections on that. And as we start this session, let's hope this works. Yes, hopefully you can see that. I just wanted to start with a piece of poetry, which I sometimes think in presentations is rather indulgent, but because I haven't seen real people for a year, I'm going to hope that you just indulge me on this one. And I'm thinking about the last kind of 18 months and what the pandemic has revealed in our society, some of the really uncomfortable, some of the really obvious things that we have perhaps avoided. But this text was taken from that fabulous poem that was written and performed by Amanda Gorman during the inauguration of Joe Biden. And I return to it, I find myself returning to it so often because I think that there are some marvelous truths in there. And when I think about the role of an inclusive leader, and people say, you know, what do inclusive leaders do? And I think, far from describing what they do, this quote often explains something about what they think. So in this space, they recognize that quiet isn't always peace. And I think it was Tara, somebody on that table, that said something like that, which I just thought, And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. So quiet, not always peaceful. And sometimes the things that we've learned to accept as this is just how stuff is done around here, this is just how we roll, sometimes just isn't fair. So if I were to describe then the mindset or the heart set or the kind set of an inclusive leader, it kind of would be this deep knowledge that the things that are presented to them might not be true, or the perspectives that they see within their organization, there might be others. And so within this, there is a curiosity, I guess, about this thing called inclusion and about these multiple perspectives that kind of culminate in some degree of truth. So that was from the Amanda Gorman poem, The Hill We Climb. And I will return to that because I think as she starts, it's really interesting. And as she ends, it's even better. But I also wanted to begin to start defining what we mean by inclusive leadership. And what we're seeing in this space is a growing body of information. So the Courage of Compassion report, we've seen some things from the King's Fund. And often we see lots of stuff that's couched in what I would describe as some form of civic virtue, you know, that requires us to be brave or courageous and vulnerable at the same time. And I don't know about you, but when I am done doing my Zoom calls for a day, I am exhausted, and courage is the last thing that I feel. And I wondered actually that if in couching this work as a piece of work that is embedded in virtue, that, you know, inclusive leaders are somehow morally better than others, or that they have this kind of moral high ground, I wondered how useful that was for the times when actually we felt fear. And there is somebody in the room that was talking about fear that I'm really thinking about you when I say this. So in those times when we feel fearful, in those times when we feel inarticulate because we are so tired, and perhaps in those times when we feel really run down and we have, it seems, no more sense of virtue, what's left? So I think I wanted to kind of think of a definition of inclusive leadership that kind of says that inclusive leaders actually are just competent leaders. They just understand how to work with and get the best out of probably the most precious resource on the planet, human beings, the people that know how to do that. And so inclusive leadership in this space then is seen as the practice of leadership that carefully includes the contributions of all stakeholders in the community or organisation. And I say carefully on purpose. So there's a sense of deliberate action in here. There's a sense of pausing, perhaps slowing down, perhaps curating. It requires us to kind of think and do differently. And then there's, for me, something really interesting about what inclusive leadership creates. So I've heard lots of people talk about, you know, the authentic leader, and I'm like, great, but the purpose of being an authentic leader is to produce what, deliver what, on behalf of whom and why. And in this scenario, the inclusive leader creates an organizational culture, but processes and outcomes that are deliberately and intentionally designed to benefit all stakeholders in the most equitable way. So in this space, the inclusive leader is thinking about, if my corporate or my organizational values speak about respect or fairness or dignity or excellence, I have to ask, have I designed my processes in ways that make that inevitable? And they might ask a deeper question is, what is it that staff need? What is the condition that they need to feel, think, believe that means that this sense of excellence, this sense of belonging is known? And that requires inclusive leaders to think and do differently. So I have spoken to lots of leaders in my many years of working in this space. And there's something really interesting about those leaders that understand that they hold a functional position within a hierarchy and can leverage their leadership to call attention to structures and processes that no longer give the results that they need or the organization needs. And I often contrast that to then leaders that kind of engage in a lot of the, I suppose, the optics of leadership. So saying the right things, but leaving intact structures that damage, cultures that harm, and outcomes that are inequitable. And so this business then of inclusive leadership then, I think, is less about courage and more about care and compassion and a desire to see nursing live up to its core values, its purpose. So my question to you is, how many inclusive leaders do you know? And do they have these kinds of conversations? Because when you hold a kind of functional authority within a hierarchy, I'm always curious about how the ways in which people leverage their leadership to achieve these kinds of outcomes. Because often what we see is the opposite. We'll hear a lot about, we ought to do X and Y, or I really get upset about B and Q. But actually, within the context of my leadership, I am unwilling, I am unskilled to be able to think about or call out or reshape and redesign processes. And so that is a lot less sexy than, I guess, some of the things that people are currently doing out there. But I think if our business is care, if our currency is compassion, we kind of need to rethink how we've been doing this. This is a slow, steady, somewhat boring process of looking through a range of things. But I guess it requires a degree of commitment to be in that space. And I think when I reflect back on what the last week and the last kind of couple of weeks have shown me, it is that where organizations neglect this work, where leaders neglect this work, often life happens in a way that kind of reminds us that time not spent on this was probably not time spent well. So we had a really interesting conversation on one of our tables, and I've forgotten the individuals now. I couldn't see, I'm getting old, so I couldn't quite see the name badge. But when we talk about leadership, and I've mentioned those that sit at a functionally high level within an organisation, I'm also really interested in thinking about different forms of leadership that we see across organisations. So much of traditional management theory has focused on structures and formalised hierarchies. But what we're noticing across many organisations now is that there are different forms of leadership, all kind of coexisting and being populated in the same space. And thinking about how we work with leaders at every single level, how we equip, how we support and give permission for people to acknowledge their own leadership role. And so when people often ask me, well, do you need to have, I don't know, director in your title? I'd say no. One of the interesting things I've heard in the last kind of few weeks is around that white people can't be effective, inclusive leaders. So I'm going to sort of offer you a bit of a challenge here. So can you see this Crayola colour wheel? And I'm going to ask you if you can locate something that is close to your own skin colour on this colour wheel. So actually, just by a show of hands, can you just tell me if you can locate something that looks a bit like your own kind of skin tone on this colour wheel? I just want to check that we've got everybody included in the room. Yeah, if you have. Yeah, not sure. Can't you see her? You're like me, you're like, what? Can't see. All right. So this is the scientific test to see if you can be an inclusive leader. And the test is this. If you take a look at your wrist, so the skin on the back of your, right? You've got skin, let's just check. Everyone has got some skin there? Yeah? Congratulations, you're in. If you have skin, you're in. You have skin in this game, you are involved, you are engaged, and you always have been engaged. You just may not have already known it. So when we're talking about inclusive leadership, that belongs to all of us, every single one of us, at every single level of our organisations, qualified, unqualified, healthcare support worker, director of nursing, chief midwifery officer, trainee midwife. This work belongs to us all. And I think there's something really powerful when we begin to recognise that each of us, regardless of our formal functional roles, acts as CEO of self. So if you got up this morning and you made it here and you navigated the kind of complexities of the London Underground and the complexities of your own life, these are actions of executive agency. Nurses at every single level, qualified or unqualified, the decision to call things out, and I can't remember, this lady, sorry, I could not see your name, even though I was struggling and my vanity meant that I could not ask you what your name was. But you made such a powerful point when we were speaking about actually understanding that leadership exists at every single level of an organisation. Might not be on your level, but it absolutely exists. And so remembering the things that Amanda Gorman taught us, that quiet isn't always peace. How are we learning to listen and lean in to the noises that actually we might not have heard if we're standing in a space where everybody like us has the kind of similar experiences? We learn autobiographically about the things that are going to be said. How are we listening to the leadership that is already alive in our organisations? So Sheila was talking about some of those fabulous examples of internationally recruited nurses who perhaps are working at band 5 in their organisation, but actually through their own work are in the middle of very powerful connected networks. So they're demonstrating what I would describe as really powerful social leadership. What we see is that in that space, they can create followers. They can create spaces where actually trust can be developed, where perhaps there was no trust before. And then I often think about those then in those very senior leadership roles where it is often lonely, where often there isn't time, where often it's really, really hard to show vulnerability. What would it be like if we understood that the business of inclusive leadership didn't belong to any one person, was not the preserve of a particular group, but belonged to us all, because we have skin and we're in. And what would it be like to embody that in our organisations? So I leave you kind of with that challenge. And we always get a few people that say, no, I don't have any skin. And I'm like, well, we'll call an ambulance and hopefully resolve that for you pretty quickly. But the business of leadership belongs to us all. And what we're learning really powerfully about in terms of inclusion is that there are so many different spaces and so many different types of leadership that we need to kind of begin to get our heads around this plurality. And once we're able to kind of do that, it's about then harnessing it. So I wanted to talk to you about this idea that of who does this agenda matter to? And I maintain that it matters to us all. So this slide outlines the so-called protected characteristics that are described by the Equality Act 2010. So just very quickly moving around the space, it talks about everybody having protection against being discriminated on the grounds of age. Now, I reached a milestone birthday this year, and I realised that I didn't have my life together. I was far from the Earth Mother, guardian of the soil. I was actually really jealous and petty. That's my big life event. But actually, I realised that I lie about my age quite a lot. So if anybody asks, I'm 29. and I'm keeping that. But your age, whether or not you choose to be truthful about it or like me lie about it, we all have an age. Some of us in this room may have a disability. It may be one that can be visible, or maybe it's something that nobody sees. Maybe it's something that you have learned to deal with. All of us in this room have a gender or a sex. We might actually have a gender identity that is different from the sex that we were assigned at birth. Everyone in this room has a race, an ethnicity, or a national origin. And it's really interesting when we begin to understand, how does that show up for us? What are some of the beliefs that we hold, that our culture holds true and strong in any particular kind of space? So there was a really interesting conversation that we had about showing respect in some cultures, not by giving somebody direct eye contact, cultural kind of construct. But in our culture, you stand up straight and you're supposed to be confident. And how difficult it must be then for people who straddle many different cultures, particularly if one of the things about our culture is often about not speaking, about the silence, about the double entendres, about not really saying what we mean, and then wondering why kind of people get a bit confused. So understanding how our culture shows up in the workplace shapes what we do, shapes and structures our expectations, a really powerful thing. We may have a religion, faith, or belief or not. The Equality Act still protects us. We may have a sexual orientation. We may be married in a civil partnership, may have been pregnant or had maternity leave. But those protected characteristics cover all of us. There is not a single person in this room that perhaps doesn't have at least 2 or 3. So when we're talking about inclusive leadership and we are talking about inclusion, we mean us. And not us on any given day, like on a Friday, because that's when we do the inclusion talk, but every single day. And just think about actually how those multiple dimensions that we have kind of show up and shape our world. So I'm learning that as a function of my age and also my sex, I sometimes have to walk into rooms and ask everybody, is the heating on? Are you hot? Are you hot? I'm constantly doing that. And that's an interesting function of, or an intersection, between 2 protected characteristics. So it's worth thinking through then that this is stuff that we all experience. And what would it be like actually if we could create organisations that made places that were fit to house human beings as complex, as difficult, and as gorgeous as they are, to produce the best possible kinds of care? Because we were able to kind of create systems, structures, processes that made inclusion an inevitability rather than an accident or something that's done at the end of something. So all of us have protected characteristics. When we're talking about inclusion, we're not talking about anybody else. We mean us. And a key part of leadership then is, how do we own this? And how do we foster and encourage ownership at every single level? Maybe in different ways, but it becomes a really interesting kind of dimension when it is no longer the preserve of the people that experience the harm, but actually those that experience the tailwinds and the privilege. And I guess what becomes really interesting in this space, and I've seen this happen across lots of organisations, is beginning to recognise that nobody experiences, for example, their nationality by itself. Everybody is going to have an age, everybody may well have a religion or belief or whatever, or they'll have a number of things that kind of shape their experience. And actually, as they age, they will change over time. And so this quote from Audre Lorde, I hope perhaps prompt something within our own thinking, that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. And if you think back to who you are and the things that you do and your own journey, how many identities have you juggled? Maybe as a carer or a friend, as a professional. How have you managed to juggle that? And then think back to our own organisations. Do we require people to have to hide in order to be accepted? Do we require people to remove parts of their identity because they don't fit? And actually, when they have to do that, it's almost like trying to run a really long race in really uncomfortable shoes. You'll probably manage it, but you probably won't end up first, and the cost will probably be bloody feet. So it's just worth thinking about then, understanding the complexity and the plurality of all of this, that this stuff isn't simple. And if we start with believing that it should all be simple, we're kind of ignoring the complexity of each one of us. So there has to be a sense or a willingness to kind of engage in the stuff that is difficult, and sometimes without a clear outcome or a right or a wrong answer, but being willing to listen to those different perspectives, always with the undercurrent of, quiet isn't always peace. What we see sometimes just isn't justice, but we may have learned to accept or be acculturated into believing that it is. What I also kind of wanted to share then is that in the last week, well, particularly I think since the football, so anyone working in the inclusion space always looks at what goes on in football. And Gareth Southgate he's either a boon or I can't quite work out how history will treat him. But we saw players take the knee. We've seen some really kind of powerful movements or moments where people have spoken out about violence against women with the murder of Sarah Everard. And I have to wonder then, is this a moment or is it a movement? And if it is just a moment where people are gonna, show up and tweet stuff and, maybe take a knee or whatever, fine. But actually, if we want to create real change, our responsibility has to be about thinking about how do we make this a movement? And so that means using your kind of leadership knowledge to kind of create structure, purpose, accountability for change. Because if we're interested in creating a really powerful movement for change, we have to recognize that kind of what we currently see isn't right, doesn't deliver. And when we're thinking about how we create a really powerful movement, we have to think about how do we galvanize others and support others to kind of be powerful in this space. And so a question that I have for you, kind of as we're thinking about this, is where do you stand? Are we kind of just waiting for all this to be over and then we'll go back to business as usual? Or is this a pivotal point? Is this an impasse, a watershed, where actually we can start to create change? I was thinking about some nurses that I spoke to during the first wave of the pandemic. And many of them were speaking about their experience of being terrified. Some of the words I remember, or some of the phrases, I didn't come to work to die. I don't know if I'm ever going to see my family again. These were really difficult things that they were facing. And I think that whenever any system goes through such a structural shock, whenever things are revealed about the structural nature of inequality in terms of those who were at greater risk of contracting COVID-19 and dying as a result, or becoming critically ill, there were things that we have seen that we can't pretend that we can unsee. There have been risks that have been taken where people must be supported to take those risks. We're not in the same space that we were, I think, at the beginning or the end of 2019. I think something fundamentally different has changed for our workforce. And what we sometimes don't see is nursing leadership adapt to meet those changes. And so if we're believing that we can go back to business as usual, I don't think we can. I don't think that this is a movement. I think it has to be a moment. And why? Well, I think as nurses, this is deserved for all of us. So if we are to kind of think about how we create a movement for change, I think that there are 5 kind of key things that we must be engaged in. So we must be focused on building accountability. because there is no point in wanting change if we can't be accountable or create systems that enable us to show what has changed. We need really great kind of leadership systems. And that means actually beginning to understand that leadership is this real mixed bag. It's not necessarily the person at the top of the organization, but it actually might be the healthcare support worker that is really getting everybody on every ward to kind of do the hand washing. It might be the nursing student that arrives and actually calls out some aspects of your culture because they have fresh eyes. It's about galvanizing all of that. The boring bit, which is about metrics. So we know across our systems that what gets measured gets done. And what I'm really interested in this space is thinking about what is meaningful to measure. What does real change look and feel like? How is it embodied? And then the narrative. I know that on our table, we talked about how the narrative needs to change. And then the final thing that I will talk very briefly about then is voice. So just to kind of go through how we might do this. So I don't know about you, but one of the things I constantly hear in organisations is that EDI, equalities work, inclusion, diversity, whatever you call it, is everybody's business. And so one of the things that what I might look at is then, so can I see everybody's job description where it sort of talks about a specific responsibility to achieve X or Y, and often it isn't there. And so what organisations may well say to me is that, well, it's implicit. And I will give them the look that I'm giving you now, really. This is my doubtful face. So one of the core things that we can start to do as leaders with strong functional hierarchical power is to strengthen and make explicit the accountability measures that we have for outcomes and activity in the inclusion space. And that might not just look like, for those of us working for NHS organisations, RES or WDES data, might be actually conversations with your staff that tell you, actually this space gives us a really powerful sense of belonging, and we're going to imagine it in this way. So who is going to be accountable? Hopefully not just one person, it's going to be many, and those people are going to be resourced to do that work. So accountability, really, really important to do something other than simply a notion of kind of quite optical leadership. And then I also wanted to share with you this idea, and I think I've said this before, about the kind of power of leadership. And so one of the really interesting things that we see inclusive leaders do is actually kind of devolve power, not work with a notion of power that's quite zero-sum. So like if you have power, I therefore have less, but recognizes that actually kind of power is something that we all can have and that we ought to have more of in terms of agency. But what we see in this space is that leadership at every single level is leveraged to support role modeling, problem solving and patient care outcomes. And that might look like in a particular space, building a kind of common set of values about what do we do when we disagree? How do we describe this language of inclusion, and what should it look, feel and sound like in our space of work? And actually giving people permission to talk about that. So if you think about your own organisation at the moment, do you talk about this stuff at your level? Whatever level you are? And what about the level below yours or above yours? Are they having those conversations? So a really, really powerful thing that leaders can begin to do at every level is begin the dialogue. And that is the most powerful tool that we have, the ability to talk, to compare, and to plan. So the actual sort of figure on there is drawn from Deloitte, and they have designed what they call the trait of inclusive leadership. And again, we have a little bit of couching here in civic virtue. So we've got a little bit on courage, but commitment, collaboration, cultural intelligence. So actually understanding that in diverse environments, the things that we say may well be interpreted in another way. But it is that bit about being conscious, intentional, clever, skilled, about making sure that your messages land. It's also about curiosity. So remembering that bit, that quiet isn't always peace. What we're seeing sometimes isn't justice, but it just is. And then cognizance, and that is the ability to kind of self-reflect and think through, how am I showing up? Or how is my culture shaping some of the expectations here? Or how is our collective culture shaping what we're expecting? And then the bit about courage. And I'm gonna say that the bit about courage is really a bit about skill. So skill that we acquire, can deploy, get better at, because on any given day, most of us may well be operating through some sense of fear. And this work should not depend on whether or not we feel courageous, or whether or not we have a secret cupboard where you might have some really shiny tights and a cape, but lands with the kind of acknowledgement that actually we are human beings, and our job and our space is to learn and to acquire skills and to become consciously inclusive. And to let go of this idea that somehow we are born knowing this. So if you think about every single skill you've acquired, you probably had to learn it. You probably failed at doing some things. And so why should this be any different? And so there is a fundamental compassion, I think, that we need to offer to ourselves as we start to think about, how do we develop these inclusive leadership skills and let go of this idea that this is somehow couched in some sense of virtue? I don't think it is. So narrative, this is a really important one. And it always asks, what are the messages that we are conveying in this space? And what are the different ways that we can say the things that need to be said? But we constantly need to think about, how are we communicating why this stuff matters? And it's interesting, I've got a very good friend who works in marketing, and she was saying to me that it takes about 170 different hits of positive information to get you to kind of buy a different toothpaste. To just even get you to even put one in your basket, you'll probably put it back. So if you're a Colgate user, or I don't know, there is only Colgate, I've obviously been brainwashed. But we often, in this space, say one thing once. One thing once in one space, and then that's it. People are somehow supposed to get it and change everything. But if it takes 170 different kind of hits of positive information to get you to kind of even think about changing your brand of toothpaste, how much harder are we going to have to work, and how much more intentional do we have to be in terms of shaping information and giving people information and knowledge about this work called inclusion, which is difficult and tough and is about skill. So thinking about how we can, depending on where you sit within an organization, think about that. Task some people with that. Be intentional about that. So if there is a great news story, fine, great. But what if there is a really bad news story? Is there an element of why this work matters in that space? One of the things that we've seen in my own organization has been our internal staff network groups. And they've been really interesting and inspirational. They work with a hashtag of present365. And what they are very clear about is that they don't just want to be talked about or referred to during LGBT History Month or Black History Month. They say quite rightly, they are there 365 days of the year. They are present in that space. And so it's important then that we recognise, support, celebrate, challenge in that space as well. So that, I suppose, is the challenge. Can we talk about this 365 days of the year? Because remember, inclusion is present whenever you are. So we should talk about us, right? Okay. And so the final element of this, I guess, is around voice. So, I started this by saying that quiet isn't always peace. And there comes a part of us that has to be interested and engaged in finding out about the lived experience of others, and to be interested in why some of those voices get silenced or are never even uttered in the first place. But a key thing that inclusive leaders do is that they they ask questions and think about, well, how are we going to listen? And how crucially are we going to respond to the lived experiences of every single member of our team? But they're asking their teams, who are we listening to? Whose voice is not here? Who isn't around this table? Whose interests are silent in this space, and why? And lots of organisations do some great work around setting up what I describe as voice mechanisms. They're absolutely crucial and important. But there also needs to be corresponding listening and action mechanisms as well. Because one of the powerful currencies that we all have in organisations is trust. And I think about, what would I do if someone was constantly asking me about my lived experience, almost wanting me to relive trauma, almost becoming a bit of a misery tourist, and nothing changed? I'd pretty much learn to keep my mouth shut so that I'm not triggering my trauma again, and maybe finding somewhere else to be. So voice is absolutely critical, but listening so powerful, and activity that's designed to respond intelligently to that is really important. So those 5 things: voice, leadership, accountability, metrics, are really, really important. And on the metrics issue, I think it's really important that we measure what is meaningful. So it's very interesting. I've been designing an inclusive leadership course, another one, come up with loads of these ideas, often over the weekend. And really, really interesting, the organisation that's kind of commissioning me to do this, we've been talking about what are the metrics, what are the KPIs? And I said, I think we should be quite radical in this space. So the organisation has said, yeah, we can really kind of do some in-depth interviews with all of the participants who have been on the course, and we can find out whether they've liked it. I was like, yeah, we can do that, but we could actually start to ask and measure the impact on those people that are led by participants. So leadership for me is a verb, and inclusive leadership is a beautiful, gorgeous set of verbs. We should be able to see that there are different outcomes, different experiences through the operation of inclusive leadership. If it delivers business as usual, something has gone wrong. And so that becomes a really interesting challenge. And the organisation and I were due to have a conversation next week, so we'll see what happens. But I guess finally, I want to say that in this space, it's not easy. It's hard. This work is nuanced and complex. It requires a new literacy that we all have to learn and build. So I can remember when I first started to do this work, learning about terms like microaggressions and micro-assaults and structural racism and, patriarchy. And I was like, what on earth do they mean? But they are powerful words because they are often used to describe things that in our culture, we generally have no words for. So giving us a new literacy gives us a new take on the world. And again, no one is born knowing what these words mean. You acquire these through knowledge and understanding. This is about skill building. And in those spaces, particularly now, when I think about the health and social care sector, there are so many brilliant examples of inclusive leaders at every single level. And when I think about them, I think again about the Amanda Gorman poem and how she ends it. And she says that, for there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it. If only we are brave enough to be it. And that bravery, I think, is that space of understanding and self-reflection that we can, we do, and will have to change because the future demands it. And when I listen to some of our young nurses and our nursing students, I am reminded most powerfully that the future is already here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. On behalf of us all at the F&F and all of the members that are here today, you have challenged us, you have got us thinking, We came here to have a conversation about inclusive leadership. I think you've given us the language now to take that conversation forward. And I hope, if anyone's like me, the real motivation now for the change that you've asked of us. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to give a final few words really to sum up the themes of today's sessions and the discussions that we've had. And I'll start with our inclusive leadership table, because the themes that Sheila has shared with me chime so beautifully with the messages that we heard there from Wendy. From your perspective, this is about authentic leadership. So this is about bringing the whole self, all of you, to your leadership in order to be inclusive. And that there is a disconnect that you recognise at the moment between the board to the floor. So the policies and the processes are talking about this, but the experiences of nurses, midwives and other healthcare professionals in our organisations are not feeling it. And that's where you think that the F&F can help you. We can help you to think about how to create safe spaces where people can raise their concerns and develop the kinds of self-awareness and emotional intelligence required to address these issues as Wendy has encouraged us to do. We also heard from you about the clinical supervision agenda, and what you've told us is that actually as chief nurses, sometimes we don't understand what we mean by this term, and we're certainly not role modelling it within our organisations ourselves. So there's some work to do there, an education piece to do there with that senior leadership so that they can understand it and advocate for it. You told us that you agree that the time is the most important issue, and to be able to protect time for our nurses and nurses particularly to access clinical supervision is what you need our help with. And you are in favour of us working with the NMC to address this. You believe this should be regulated for, and you also agree with the partnership we've made with the RCN to take this forward. In terms of our education programme, we've had some amazing ideas of how we can make that education programme engaging and to cover the areas and the topics that are most salient and important to you. You want us to help with this bridge between and the movement and transition we're making into the ICSs, and how we can help nurses to take their place at the decision-making table within that particular forum. We see this as a real opportunity for us, but we know that we'll need development in order to take that opportunity. You want to hear more about the career journeys of nurses so that we can aspire our early career nurses and those that have gone down a certain path and feel that that's the path that they're stuck on, how they can make different directions. And lots of the people within the room today shared their own career journeys, and we have lots of inspirational speakers amongst us that we will be drawing into that webinar programme, so you can share those experiences with all of our members. And finally, there was something there about mentorship. You recognise that mentorship is very rarely offered, but so key. And many of you gave great examples of the significance of mentorship to yourselves and the career decisions that you've taken. So we will take that on board and look into how the F&F can support that mentorship network. And you'll certainly be requested and required to contribute to it as well as to benefit from it. And Greta tells me that for us, our next steps are about visibility. We need people to know about us. The F&F is still regarded as an exclusive and elite organisation. We have some work to do there, and particularly around raising our profile in other fields of practice. So not just so that the acute medical areas perceive F&F as for them. You agree with us around global being our next 5-year vision, and you particularly like the idea of forwarding the agenda around a collective voice, and you see that F&F can have a place with bringing together that one voice for nursing. And you see that there's a potential for us to be an accrediting body or part of an accrediting process, so we can be part of driving that nursing excellence forward, and as I mentioned before, that should be on a global level. So we've got lots of work to do. We've got so many ideas, but it's very exciting. And the great thing about it is that this is just the start for us. We've gotten all this information from you now. We will be drawing upon you as our resource and our network to take this agenda forward. And we thank you so much for believing in the potential of the membership of the F&F Academy and been right at the beginning of this very exciting journey with us. So I'm going to pause now so we can all have a cheers and a drink, and thank you very much.